Hey folks, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about deployment strategies for Elastic Beanstalk. Now, with Elastic Beanstalk, you can quickly deploy and manage applications in the AWS cloud without worrying about the infrastructure that runs those applications. And a common scenario is maybe for a software shop who do not have any AWS DevOps engineers. So in those types of situations, Elastic Beanstalk may be a better option than CloudFormation. CloudFormation gives you more control, but Elastic Beanstalk is fairly easy to ramp up on. So Elastic Beanstalk reduces management complexity without restricting choice or control. You simply upload your application and Elastic Beanstalk automatically handles the details of capacity provisioning. So in the DevOps doctrine, let's go into deployment strategies. Now, before we talk about deployment strategies, let's talk a little bit about environment types. So looking at our diagram, there are two environment types: load balancing and auto scaling, where auto scaling handles launching, configuring, and terminating instances. The load balancer handles client requests and communications with back-end instances. Now, if you don't need all of that, there are single instance environments. So it's one instance with an elastic IP address, and you're probably wondering, why an elastic IP address? Well, there's still an auto-scaling group, but the idea is to keep one instance running at all times. So if you have an elastic IP address and you need to replace your single instance, you can just move the elastic IP address over to the new instance. So there's an auto-scaling group, but there's no scaling. It's just one instance, and there's no load balancer. Now, a use case for a single instance environment is maybe you just need one remote box. Maybe you need to set up a test site quickly, and this would be a good use case for using the single instance environment. So let's check this out in the management console. So I'm going to create a new environment and web server environment. Check for availability. Choose a platform. Let's go with PHP. We'll go with the sample application again. Create environment. All right, while our environment is building, let's continue with the lesson. This will take a few minutes. So the main reason to be aware of the environment types is that the environment type affects how we do updates. So think about it. For a single instance environment, it doesn't make sense to employ rolling updates. And of course, where you have a load balancer and an auto-scaling group with more than one instance, well, then a rolling update may make sense. All right, quickly want to bounce back over to the management console. So our environment has launched and everything is okay. We have a healthy instance. What if we change our mind? What if we want a different environment type? So let's go into configuration. Now, first of all, we can change the instance type. Let's go from a T1 micro to a T2 small and click apply. I'm getting a warning about this not being free tier. That's all right. Confirm. So Elastic Beanstalk is updating our environment. Now, one other thing I want to show. Let's go back into configuration, capacity, environment type, single instance. And right here, we can change to a load balanced environment. Minimum instance size 1, maximum of 4. That sounds better. So we can easily go from a single instance environment to a load balanced auto scaling environment. I'm not going to do that right now. Just wanted to show that capability. So I'll cancel out of this. Go back to the dashboard. All right, so let's talk about the deployment options available to us. And there are 5. All at once, rolling, rolling with additional batch, immutable, and blue-green. And these can apply to updating our environment and rolling back our environment to a previous version. Let's first talk about the all-at-once deployment method. So all at once updates all existing instances at the same time with an in-place update. So we've looked at this with rolling updates, and I just want to emphasize that it does them all at the same time. And as you would expect, one of the pros of this method is its speed. It is the fastest method. Now, having gone through the other lessons, you probably know the drawback of that as well. It's going to cause downtime because it's not keeping one instance active at all times. It's updating them all at once. So there's going to be that switchover, and you will have some downtime. Not a huge amount of downtime, but it's just good to be aware of it and factor it into your decision making. Now, another good thing about this method is that it does not force a DNS change. And that's a really good feature because DNS changes should be avoided if possible. They can cause issues downstream. And on deployment failure, if we have to roll back to a previous version, we have to redeploy that old working version. Now, what if we have a requirement where we can't have any downtime? What do you think our option would be in that case? And we should know this one by now, the rolling deployment. So it prevents downtime by removing a batch of instances from rotation, but it's always keeping at least one instance up. So there's not going to be any downtime. And we're going to have control over how many instances are updated at once. So what happens is, Elastic Beanstalk, if you have a batch of instances that you want to update, it detaches those instances from your load balancer, performs the update, and then reattaches those instances. So it's not quite the same as your typical rolling update with an auto-scaling group, but the overall principle and the basic use case is the same. Again, if you don't want any downtime, this is certainly a great option. Now, just remember, when the ELB reattaches these instances, it's going to perform its health checks again. So we have to reestablish that health again before we proceed. So there's that overhead, but again, it's not a huge deal because we always have at least one instance that is up. Another important note is that Elastic Beanstalk is keeping an eye on these health checks. Elastic Beanstalk detaches the instances in the batch, updates them, reattaches them, and then it is waiting for that health check confirmation. So those instances have to become okay before Elastic Beanstalk moves on to the next batch. So we're either looking at okay, or there's going to be a failure of our update. Now, this is a drawback to this deployment method because the rollback becomes a little bit complicated. So let's think about this. If we're doing a rolling deployment in batches, let's say the first batch works. Let's say the second batch fails. So we are going to have 2 batches of instances with different versions. Now, what we then have to do to roll back, we look at the deployment ID for each of the batches. Then we can manually terminate the instances from the failed deployment, and then Elastic Beanstalk automatically replaces those instances with the version of the last successful deployment. With this type of deployment, if you have a failure, you could have imbalanced versions in your auto-scaling group. So that's definitely a drawback. Just to summarize, on deployment failure for rolling deployments, we would redeploy with another rolling deployment. And that has to be preceded by terminating instances with the failed version. All right, so let's click on Key Concepts and let's finish our discussion on deployment methods. And our next deployment method is rolling with additional batch deployment. So the hallmark of this deployment type is that it updates one batch of instances at a time, starting with a new batch of instances, not in rotation. So let's say we have two batches of instances containing two instances apiece for a total of 4. So this new batch would be additional instances, let's say an additional 2. So that's just important to understand. It's introducing brand new instances into the auto-scaling group. You have a good idea of the amount of traffic that you're serving throughout the day. And let's say you know that you need 4 instances up at all times. So if you're doing rolling updates in batches, well, you wouldn't want to subtract from your total of instances. So with rolling with additional batch deployment, this additional batch is going to cover your bandwidth needs, basically. The rolling update would proceed. Again, Elastic Beanstalk is looking for those health checks. This proceeds until there's the last batch with the old version, and by then, you've replaced those instances already. Those old instances with the old version can then just be terminated. Now, some of the pros of this deployment method are, of course, same benefits as the rolling deployment, but there's the extra caveat that it's preventing any capacity issues where you can't afford to subtract instances from your auto-scaling group. You're actually adding the additional batch to handle your workload. Now, there's always a trade-off, and what is the con of this method? It's going to take a little bit longer than the rolling deployment. It's just a numbers game. We're actually adding instances, so it's just going to take a little bit longer. Now, on failure, we would just redeploy with another rolling with additional batch deployment. All right, that brings us to immutable deployment. Now, the first couple deployment methods worked with existing instances. The last one we covered, rolling with additional batch, was kind of a hybrid, working with existing instances as well as introducing a new batch. Now, what if you want to do an update? What if, and it could be various reasons, but you want brand new instances. You just want to completely do away with the old instances. For that use case, immutable deployment is a good option. And immutable deployment replaces existing instances with new instances, and here's the new part, by creating a temporary auto-scaling group. It tests one instance with the new application or configuration, and then adds the new instances to the original auto-scaling group while terminating the original instances and then terminating the temporary auto-scaling group. So the pros to this method is that it prevents downtime and it's using new resources instead of in-place updates. It tests the new application and configuration on a single instance before launching more. It's a simple and clean rollback on deployment failure because basically you're not doing anything with those old instances until the new ones are in place and ready. Now the con for this is it doubles the number of instances for a short period of time. Obviously there's a cost factor, and you always have to keep an eye on your EC2 region limits. So what do you do on deployment failure? Well, you just terminate the temporary auto-scaling group and instances. And before moving on, I want to clarify. So again, this method doubles the number of instances for a short period. Well, what if you have 15 instances to start with? Well, by default, you're only allowed 20 in a region. So if you double, you're going to be at 30. You're going to be over your capacity. So in those situations, this would not be a good option. So overall, the immutable deployment method is best for production environments where we want to minimize downtime and reduce the impact of failed deployments. And then there's blue-green deployments. There's actually a whole section on blue-green deployments later in the course, but I'll touch on it here briefly. Very similar to the immutable deployment, replaces all resources, but it replaces all resources, including the ELB, autoscaling group, and instances. So this is just a matter of deploying a whole new environment. And again, we're replacing everything. So we're deploying a whole new environment, and then we're doing a DNS changeover to that new environment. So again, I'll talk much more on blue-green deployments in the upcoming section, but let's just be aware that it's certainly an option for Elastic Beanstalk. For these types of updates, let me just show, let's go into configuration, and here we have rolling updates and deployments. Let's click modify. Note, before we do that, deployment policy right now, all at once. Rolling updates disabled, health check, as we saw, is enabled. Let's click modify. And we have two drop downs that factor into this: the deployment policy all at once or immutable, and also the rolling update type. Right now it's disabled, and my option right now is immutable. So on this page we can configure our deployment type. Here's our health check information. All right, let's cancel out, go back to the dashboard. All right, so in this lesson, we've looked at our deployment methods. And with that, we have completed this lesson. Go ahead and mark it complete, and let's move on.